Okay, we're going to just wait 2 seconds and we are going to proceed. Congratulations. You keep saying that. I was trying to wink at you to say you were all right. Okay, we're nearly there. There's a few more people to take the seats, and we're just going to wait a moment. Okay, Rob away. Okay, everybody, I'm just going to make a few announcements now as I speak. First of all, I have 3 names of people who haven't booked out of the rooms, and the hotel have asked me to read them out. I hate embarrassing you, but however, Mr. Eamon Fortune, Mr. Declan Doyle, and Mrs. Margaret Payne. Okay, so the hotel needs you to book out of your room as they need the rooms, okay? Thank you very much. And just in relation to, you'll see on your seat there's some feedback forms. We would really ask you to fill them in and put them into the feedback boxes, which are just outside the door, and some of the staff will direct you if you're finding it difficult to find them on the way out. And there's also a box there where you can recycle the lanyards or whatever you'd like to call them. So just these can be recycled, or if you want to hold on to them also. But there's a box outside where we can recycle those, okay? We are delighted and privileged to have Dr. Harry Barry here with us today. He is a best-selling author and doctor based in Drogheda, County Louth. He has a particular interest in the area of mental health, dealing with issues such as depression, anxiety and addiction in his practice. He regularly features on national radio, print and TV to discuss mental health issues such as Today FM, News Talk, Irish Independent and The Late Late. He was moved to write Flagging the Problem following a particular tragic death by a suicide in a local family in his area. He is committed to seeking to counteract the disruptive effect of mental illness locally and nationally. Other books by Harry Barry are Flagging the Stress, Flagging the Therapy, Flagging the Depression. We are delighted to have him here today. Dr. Barry has said he has explored the mystery of suicide by looking at mental health issues behind it, as well as the neurobiological, and I can't pronounce that as you can see. You can see I wouldn't be a doctor of suicide. He has learned more by listening to those that have been survivors of suicide who have had very serious attempts by helping countless others. So I just actually ask you to give him a big round of applause, because we're very delighted to have him here with us.
Many thanks, everybody. It was a pleasure to be asked to be here today, and I was asked to really speak on some area of mental health, and I really wasn't sure what in God's name. I'm in the presence of people with so much knowledge and information, but I decided eventually that I would do anxiety. The reason for that is that I think this is an area that actually causes an enormous amount of problems in society, and it's kind of a lot of it is very hidden. We know a lot about depression, and I do an awful lot of work in this area, and the suicide thing we can bring up later if necessary. So I'm going to just talk today about anxiety. So what I'm going to try to do, I'm going to explain the mood system briefly in the brain, mention briefly toxic stress, but I'm not actually going to deal very much with that. I'm going to look at the whole area of acute anxiety, panic attacks and phobias, chronic anxiety like post-traumatic stress, OCD and general anxiety. That's what our brain looks like. I often wonder, when you take the brain outside the body and look at it, it's a pretty scary thought to think that that's what keeps moving and walking during the daytime. We have a right and a left-sided brain. This is very, very important, really, because they interact very much together, but they actually work slightly differently in many ways. And in many ways, if you were to look at them, the right side of your brain is very much your creative side, and your left side of your brain is very much your logical, analytical side. So a very good way of looking at it is that the left side of your brain would see that that's a door. The right side of your brain would fill in all the data about the door. It's a white door. It's surrounded like this. So it gives the richness and texture. And that's very, very important because we need both of those in order to survive. So I remember having great fun up in St. Pat's once asking, where did the mind come from? And after 5 minutes, somebody eventually came up with the possibility that it might come from the brain. Because really, it was a very interesting question. I started looking up at the ceiling eventually and saying, well, I wonder what is it up there. So the mind is a function of the living brain. And we can argue philosophically all day long about whether it comes from somewhere else, but I think the accepted, shall we say, definition is that the mind is a function of the living brain. We all have an emotional and logical brain. And if there's one message I want you to go away from today, it's that. It's the message I try to leave with every audience. Most psychological illnesses are due to a breakdown in communication between your emotional and your logical brain. It's as simple as that. The problem with mental health is we spent about 50 years making it as complicated as we can. Okay, so I often feel if we actually just accepted it was simply a breakdown in communication between our emotional and logical brains, or for those who don't like the word brain, a breakdown in communication between our emotional and logical minds. So many years ago I was very frustrated with the way in which the whole mental health debate was going on, and I decided I would try and look at neuroscience as giving us some kind of background into the whole area. So in order to make it simple for people, I came up with the idea of the flag system. So that basically meant the flag was composed of our frontal mood department, our logical brain at the front of the brain, our limbic mood department, which is our emotional brain in the middle of our brain, our adrenal stress gland, and our glucocortisol, our stress hormone. These make up the word flag. And it's incredible to think, but everything we do, our mood, our behavior, how we respond to stress, anxiety, everything comes back to this little system. There is a simple diagram of the emotional brain, or the logical brain here, which it's 29% of the brain is composed of the prefrontal cortex. It's our rational problem-solving part of the brain. It helps us to be creative, analyze, plan, and also involved in short-term memory. It helps us control mood. Really, really important. This is the part of our brain that's important in controlling behavior, particularly impulsive, self-destructive, i.e. suicide behavior. Self-harm and suicide behavior come from this part of the brain. That's one of its jobs. It's also very, very important in our social relationships and empathy. As therapists, I always say, I don't really give a damn what system you're using or what type of therapy you're using. I just want to know how good are you in empathy. If you're not good in empathy, as far as I'm concerned, well, get out of the business, because that's what it should be all about. And believe it or not, this is the part of your brain from which empathy comes. This is, if you divide it into 4 parts, you have your attention box. I only use these terms as kind of describing really what they do. Your logic box, your emotion control box, and your social behavior box. So what do these do? Well, your logic box is often called the executive brain. It's in charge of your planning and decision making. Do you know the way your something major decision has to be made, and all the bits of data will be coming in, but eventually something in your brain will say, right, that's what I'm going to do. Well, this is the guy that probably makes that decision. The emotional control box, very important, in charge of monitoring and modifying our emotions. Social control box, this is the guy in charge of empathy. And this is the guy that, when the baby is born, from the very second the baby looks at the mother's face and senses everything about her, that part of your brain is switched on. So long before, the brain is only 10% formed when you're born as a baby, but already this part of your brain is switching in. So I often say Freud was right, but for the wrong reasons. Okay? The attention box, very, very important. Therapists don't realize, but this is the part of your brain and I use this word, which I absolutely detest, your client's brain, which are interacting, okay? And it's in charge of focusing attention on our emotions, linking them to our thoughts and our behavior, and it's where we reappraise emotions. So when a person reappraises emotions, this is the part of the brain that's actually active. This is your emotional brain. 3 little boxes there, your memory, stress, and pleasure box. Your stress box, its true name is called the amygdala. It's in charge of your whole stress system, and it's involved in how you process emotions, particularly negative ones. So this is the guy involved in fear, anxiety, and depression. It's at the heart of the emotional brain and the key player in both. The memory box is called your hippocampus. It's involved in how you create, store, and retrieve memories. And this is the guy that goes down in Alzheimer's disease. It's very, very important as well in both anxiety and depression because it gets very much affected in both conditions. Your pleasure box, which our children are experts are, is called the nuclear accumbens. This is the one that gives you a buzz when you enjoy food, sex, and alcohol, and anything else that our young people get up to. Now, which of the hours is bigger here? Which of the hours is bigger? Yeah, very, very interesting. For many years, it was always thought that the logical brain was more powerful than the emotional brain, but a guy called Ledoux went in and examined all this area and discovered a lot more connections between your emotional brain and your logical brain than in reverse. So this is a key point in our mental health, because our lives are basically ruled more by emotion than logic. And every decision we make each day is a kind of a balance between those two. So if I give you a simple example of that, you're going by a Chinese takeaway or an Italian takeaway, and you're 3 stone overweight, and your logical brain switches on and says, yeah, God, if I have another Chinese now, I'm going to have to work a lot harder next week. And your emotional brain smells the Chinese. What do you think wins? And another nice example is it's 3 a.m, you're out with your girlfriend, it's flogging rain, it's like it is at the moment, howling wind, freezing cold. The girls have nothing on and the boys have nothing on, and their logical brains are telling them, well, Jesus, we better get the hell out of this before we get pneumonia. But thankfully, and hopefully, their emotional brains are saying, l'amour. So when we're well, you know, these two emotions, or these two sides of ourselves, our emotions and our logic, are in harmony. But when we're unwell, this is when the fun begins. Negative emotions appear and overwhelm our logical brain, and the classic examples are anxiety and depression. So one of the ways in which our emotion and logical brains are connected is by 3 big mood cables. That was the only way I could come up with of describing them. It was very interesting. Out of 1 billion neurons and 9 billion helper cells, each of these little cables here has less than about 50,000 neurons. So a very tiny number of neurons affect us hugely. Like you all hear about serotonin. Do you ever hear about serotonin? You know, in some ways I think we hear far too much about serotonin, but anyway. Serotonin is basically primarily in this little cable up along here. And probably only about maybe 40,000 neurons, maybe less. And yet they are so important. They're involved in our mood, sex, sleep, appetite, memory, and impulsive behavior. So a good rule of thumb is if your serotonin system is going down, you'll become far more impulsive, and that's where self-harm comes from. Noradrenaline cable is very involved in energy, sleep, drive, and concentration. This guy is involved very much in, say, chronic stress, as we'll see. Your dopamine cable, again, our kids are good at this as well. Our sense of enjoyment of basically anything that gives them a buzz as well. This is your adrenal gland. You have one on either side of your body, okay, sitting on top of your kidneys. Very, very important guy, because stress and cortisol are key players in all these conditions. And very simple breakdown of your stress system is your stress box up here, your amygdala is in charge of it. So when you're acutely stressed, you release adrenaline and noradrenaline. We'll look at those in a second. And when you're chronically stressed, you release glucocortisol. So acute stress, dry mouth, stomach in knots, heart thumping, mind alert and vigilant, fight or flight. For your own information, which hormone tells you to flee and which hormone tells you to fight? Adrenaline tells you to flee and noradrenaline tells you to fight. Why is that important? You see, these things at one level are not important, but at another level become very important. If I'm walking home and a guy comes at me with a hatchet, what happens is my stress system connects up, my mouth goes dry, my stomach goes into knots, my heart thumping, and if I have any sense, I'm going to do a runner. So my body is being prepared to do a runner. Okay? Now, suppose I'm walking home and I have my girlfriend with me, and I can't do a runner because the two of us would, she would be at risk. So now I have to turn around and fight. Now my face will change. All my muscles will tense up. My heart will go quick. My mouth might go dry. But I'm now ready to fight. Okay? So a very nice way of looking at people who handle stress, in terms of acute stress, people who handle stress by releasing mainly adrenaline get anxious. People who handle stress by releasing noradrenaline mainly get angry and frustrated. So the next time you see a guy on your tail end, on the M1 or M50 or whatever like that, blasting you out of the way, you know you're meeting a noradrenaline guy. By the way, his life expectancy is a lot less. Okay, when we get chronically stressed, we start pouring out loads of cortisol, and my God, our country has a lot of cortisol flying at the moment. There's a lot of people in trouble. Chronic stress happens when we are under sustained pressure for long periods of time. And what happens is we start to get these kind of symptoms. And I bet you, if anybody here in the audience who haven't felt these, well, I want you to stand up and take a bow, because fair just, okay. We get tired. We lose concentration. We don't sleep very well. We lose interest in things, food, sex, drive. We get more anxious, a bit more impulsive. Tired but wired is a great description. Tired but wired. You're at the end of a day. You want to sleep, but you're all wired up. It's fueled by high cortisol level and usually of much longer duration. I'm only going to just mention toxic stress because it really is a talk in itself. And that's where stress becomes so persistent and so pervasive that we start to develop physical and psychological consequences. I regard it as probably the greatest single threat to our mental and physical health at the moment. If you want to read more about, learn more about that, you can read Flagging Stress. It's a very simple description of it. Okay. But I want to move on to anxiety. What is anxiety? Well, I love these definitions. It's basically an uncomfortable state of hyper-alertness due to fear. It's a normal I'm going to use that word, normal human emotion. Feelings of anxiety are normal under threat, and physical changes are a normal part of that response. And avoidance and safety behaviour are a normal reaction to anxiety. So, anxiety disorders, I'm going to just deal with these. Panic attacks, panicky symptoms, which are kind of acute anxiety. Phobias, which are acute anxiety. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which is more chronic. OCD, and general anxiety disorder. If anybody wants to, ask me any questions, by the way, probably better if you ask me at the end. Is that okay? But you can ask me. If something particular you want to ask me as we're going along, you can. Now, I think it's important that we distinguish firstly between panic attacks and panic disorder, panicky feelings, and phobias. The panic attacks and panicky disorder or panic disorder is where we're anxious about being anxious. Panicky feelings where we're anxious about something. Phobia is fear of exposure or to something or a situation where one runs the risk of becoming incredibly anxious. So it's a red herring. Have you ever heard that term? Phobia is a red herring. Panic disorder affects about 150,000 people every year. It's defined as a condition where a person suffers from recurrent panic attacks, where they spend a lot of their time worrying about the recurrence of such attacks. And we clearly identify the first episode from which future episodes will start. And if you think this isn't a problem, I got a call recently about looking for some advice about a man who's still in his house since his late 1970s or something like that he hasn't left the house as a result of panic disorder, and looking for advice as to what to do with it. This can be an incredibly crippling condition. It's commoner in women. Why is anxiety commoner in women in general? There's a very good question, isn't it? I'll let you think about that one. You can tell me at the end, okay? Up to 8% of the population have at least one episode in their life. Isn't that very interesting that at least 8% of the population will have at least one panic attack in their life? 5%, only about 5% are recurrent. So it's very commonly associated with general anxiety, depression, and addiction. And you have to be very careful with the last one. If you see a young person with panic attacks, always check for the substances, usually hash. They can occur at any situation at any time. And the fear of getting them, which we call panic disorder, is as big a problem as the attacks themselves. In my experience, the fear of getting the attacks is a much bigger problem than the actual attacks. So it's the fear of, oh my God, when they're going to happen, is really the problem. They're caused by an inadvertent firing of our stress system, an adrenaline rush. So they often present like this. Do you remember we were doing the acute stress there a minute ago? Sounds a bit similar, doesn't it? Sweating, palpitations, dry mouth, weakness, chest pain, hyperventilation, headaches, shakes, choking, stomach and knots. Choking is the one, by the way, which can become a problem in itself. Many people will actually move on from the panic attack to choking becoming a new problem. And the real problem is the person has this fear. I'm going to get a heart attack. I'm going to get a stroke. I'm going to make a fool of myself. I'm going to run amok, or I'm going to die. And it'll usually be one of these things that's actually behind the problem to start with. I went there recently, and the person actually, their big problem was that they would make a fool of themselves. So people vary in which it is. There's often no obvious trigger. Why is that? Why is there no obvious trigger? Well, what started the panic attack to start with? What was the very first thing that the person got when they had the panic attack? Hands up everybody who thinks it's a thought. Okay. Anyone else? Any ideas? A feeling. What does a feeling mean, by the way? Yeah, you're getting closer. Okay, what do you mean by a physiological symptom?
Like a sudden rush of a feeling of sickness, for example, in the stomach.
Okay.
Churning in the stomach. That comes, has been described to me that way. That comes on from nowhere.
Very good.
And it happens before a thought ever.
Okay. Are most people busy worrying about their thoughts when this happens? No, I think the key is that there is an actual trigger, but the trigger is never identified by the person. It's not a trigger in the form of being afraid, or that something has actually technically happened. It's actually, as you rightly pointed out, we can use the word physiological. I would probably call it just a simple physical symptom of being anxious. Isn't that right? Like they might become aware of their hearts. They might find that suddenly they have a bit of difficulty breathing. They might suddenly have a knot in their stomach. So it's usually a simple physical symptom. But what's that symptom a symptom of? Being anxious, yeah. So the trigger is actually that, isn't it? So there is a trigger, you know. So when we call it being anxious about being anxious, that's what we're talking about, isn't it? But it's not the physical. Remember, it's not the physical symptom they get that's causing the problem, is it? It's what they think is going to happen. Always remember that. Always look, what does the person think is going to happen? Yeah, it's what they think is going to happen. And if you check with them, you'll find it'll always be one of these things. I thought I was going to die. It's a very common one. And mind you, I'd be a bit worried myself if I thought I was going to die. So, inevitably I'm going to get anxious, aren't I? But for other people, it's I'm going to make a fool of myself, I'm going to run amok, I'm going to die. We look at the run amok later. So what happens, obviously, is that the person, in this case, is firing their acute stress system, isn't it? So they're now, if I came at you with a hatchet, you'd fire your acute stress system, isn't that right? But now I have this new fear that something terrible is going to happen and I'm going to die. So now I'm going to fire my stress system. So panic attacks are triggered by your emotional brain feeling anxious. The stress block produces the adrenal gland, will produce adrenaline. This is actually what happens in the body. The same emotional brain, which, as I keep saying, gets us into trouble all the time, misinterprets these physical symptoms as being something dangerous. So it encourages the adrenal stress gland to produce more adrenaline, a huge burst of it, isn't that right? And that's what gives you the full-blown panic attack. Does that make sense? The initial symptoms are as symptoms of anxiety. We interpret them as dangerous, demand that they stop. That's the problem, isn't it? We demand they stop. That's why most people get into trouble. That it's the demand that they stop that causes them their problem. Because the more you demand they stop, the more anxious you get. The more anxious you get, the more you trigger them. So eventually you get a full-blown severe panic attack. And then obviously people use safety behaviour, don't they? They're told by everybody, get out the brown paper bag, or do some breathing exercises, or sometimes they go to A&E. Sometimes they'll take tranquilizers. And all of these things are aimed at basically getting rid of these serious symptoms. Why? Because they're so dangerous. So that's the kind of cycle of the panic attack. So a very good way of looking at it is initial physical symptoms: heart going quicker, sudden difficulties breathing, the danger I'll go mad, have a heart attack, run amok. The demand that these physical symptoms go away. Emotion is panic and behaviour is safety. So that's a panic attack. They're simply caused by bursts of adrenaline. These call all the panic attack symptoms. This is the secret. They are uncomfortable but not dangerous. Normalise the symptoms and you normalise the person. Okay? Normalise the symptoms. That's the key. The initial symptoms are those of anxiety, they're not dangerous, so panic attacks are simply being anxious about being anxious. They're best treated with CBT. You know, the terrible thing about panic attacks is a few simple CBT, I call it the most basic CBT interventions, can actually solve a problem that a person might have had for many, many years. Try and avoid tranquilizers. Avoid antidepressants because they're not, unfortunately, they're sometimes being given for this, and I don't think they're a good idea at all, unless depression is actively present. Occasionally, panic attacks will be part of a depression cycle, in which case they may have to be used. They're easy to treat if people come for help, but the problem is people don't come for help. When do people come for help? Why do people ever come for help? When the cost gets too high. Isn't that right? We only change our behaviour when our cost gets too high. When the cost gets too high. So if they have another condition like depression or addiction, always watch for addiction. The young guys, hash, okay? They'll often come into you, like one guy came into me and I took one look at him after listening to him for a few minutes and I said, well, how much stuff are you on? And he says, how did you know I stuff? I said, well, because it was very obvious from your descriptions, you know. So think, particularly with younger people. Older people, it might be alcohol. Younger people, think of drugs. Okay? It's important because what happens is they get into this vicious circle is when they're not using the stuff, their emotional brain, do you remember the pleasure box? It starts firing like mad because it's craving the stuff. It sends information to the stress box, which then becomes anxious. That starts giving you these physical symptoms, which you now misinterpret as being dangerous, and they get their panic attacks. Never try and stop an attack. That's what gets everybody into trouble. They're trying to stop them. They're simply an adrenaline rush. A very good way of looking at it is your emotional brain there to kill? Is your stress system there to kill you? I can speak with great authority on my acute stress system because I met a leopard when I was in Africa, about 10 yards away. And my stress system froze me, okay? And that's why I'm here to having the chat. Okay? So I often quote that to people, you know, with panic attacks and say, well, is your stress system there to kill you? And he says, well, if it is, well, it's not, you know, we wouldn't be around very long, would we? Because its job is to help us survive. Now, when you explain that to a person and they realise, hey, that all that's happening is their stress system, which is there to help them, is actually just been inadvertently fired, they start to lose their fear. Try and get them to avoid safety behaviour at all costs. Try and teach them that if they do nothing, it'll pass in 10 minutes. The average length of time of a panic attack, if you do nothing, is 10 minutes. If you try to stop it, it can last for up to an hour. Texting is an interesting one to try. You know, just when you're in the middle of an episode, imagine that you're texting the symptoms back to yourself. And often in the process of doing that, by the time they've done it, it'll be over. So the initial symptoms are symptoms of anxiety, uncomfortable but not dangerous. Now, panicky feelings. I think these are because an awful lot of the time people will come in to me and say, Doctor, I'm having panic attacks. But when you actually listen to them carefully, they're not having panic attacks. They're getting simply panicky feelings. These are more caused by specific situations or thoughts. They're very common to us all. But if they get very persistent, they're often an indicator of something underlying like a general anxiety disorder. And they have to be treated as normal, and are once again triggered by the emotional brain's stress box, and they're usually physical with a lot of mental worry and overlay present. Phobias. These are one of the commonest conditions affecting human beings. This is where, I love these definitions again, excessive and persistent fear of being exposed to particular situations or objects, where the exposure to either leads to an immediate anxiety response and a need to avoid a phobic stimuli. I love these definitions, okay? What that basically means in practice is that the person is afraid of a situation, okay, in which they will become incredibly anxious. So they can be defined as follows. Simple kind of animal type, spider phobias, snake phobias, exposure to situations like confined spaces, crowds, open spaces, which we call agoraphobia. That comes from the Greek, I presume you know that, Greek meaning marketplace. Lifts, planes. Lifts are a very common one, by the way. Planes, we'll be doing later. Motorways. I've had some beautiful motorway ones. I had one man come up from Kerry to Drogheda through the back roads. Can you imagine? And I said to him, why did you come? Because, well, that's why I'm here, Dad. I must say I'm very proud of one particular person I've been working with who, by the way, was very interesting. By the time he'd finished working with me, he realised his real problem was a kind of a general anxiety thing rather than, but this is how it presented. It was like a secondary thing. So fear of getting on the motorway. And complex phobias like social phobia, really important one. Social anxiety disorder, where our fear relates to meeting people. Pretty hard one to avoid, isn't it? You can't avoid meeting people. So we'll just go through a few of these. Agoraphobia, very common distressing condition, affects around 20,000 people, a lot of people. Fear of open spaces comes from the Greek word agora, meaning marketplace. So in other words, human beings haven't changed in 2,000 years, have they? Very interesting, isn't it? We think with all our modern technology that we're different, but we're not. We're still the same. Sufferers may dread leaving the house, entering churches. The church is a huge, huge one. Shopping centres, well, very soon it won't be. Shopping centres, lifts, supermarkets, really paralysing for particularly mothers who need to go into supermarkets. It causes their lives huge difficulties. And other crowded areas. Some will struggle. I had one lady who had to go out to her bedroom. She couldn't leave her bedroom. Very isolating condition. And the real fear, this is the secret, the real fear of the person with a phobia is that actually they're going to get a panic attack. And if they're exposed in such places. So it's not surprising that it's often linked to panic disorder. Social phobia is a very important condition. Very common disabling condition where the person suffers from intense anxiety in social situations for a period of greater than 6 months. That's an important distinction, okay? Everybody. I can remember being a young teenager, and Jesus, I would have been intensely socially anxious in situations. And I don't know of, let's put it like this, very, very few teenagers, if they're straight with you, are not suffering from the same. But it's different if it's a prolonged, persistent condition. And it's all about experiencing a persistent fear. This is the secret to social phobia. They're afraid that they're going to be judged harshly by others and are embarrassed by their own actions. This is all in their own heads, by the way. Okay? That's the important part. It's what's going on in their head. That they're going to be embarrassed by their own actions in social situations. So they can be triggered by real or imagined scrutiny by others. In social phobia, the symptoms of anxiety, they can be quite, distressing. Blushing. A lot of people come to me with blushing. Excessive sweating. Mind going blank. Stammering, which are often presenting symptoms of this condition. One man was brought to me from England. He was a very good tennis player. And he wasn't achieving his the targets he should have been for the quality of his play. And they asked me to see him because he just wasn't doing well. And when I actually got him the man on his own, it has nothing to do with his tennis at all. It was his big fear was that when he went on to the tennis court, that people would see that he was sweating. And this paralysed him when he went on, so he therefore became inefficient at what he was doing. So when you actually dealt with that, the rest was actually fairly simple. The difficulty with social phobia is, unlike other situations where continuous exposure might lessen the condition, in social phobia this doesn't happen. So about 8% of the population, which is again a very large number of people, suffer from some form of it. The key behavioural responses are social avoidance, which makes it worse. So I'm just going to briefly deal with these two. Performance situations. This involves a situation where a person performs in front of another or is being observed by other people, i.e. me. You're observing me. So this is a performance. Okay? So if I suffered from social phobia, I would be freaking it. As it is, I'm just incredibly anxious. Okay. Now, the other type of ones are social interaction situations, which involve engaging or interacting with other people. So let's have a look at these. Examples of typical social interaction situations would be where a person says to you, well, I'm really afraid of starting or maintaining a conversation. So they're actually busy in their own head before they open their mouth, thinking about what will I say, how will I say it, or if the conversation's going on, how will I continue the conversation? Meeting strangers is a huge challenge for them. Going to parties or having friends over for dinner, meeting friends in the pub. Expressing personal opinions or being assertive. And talking to people in authority or returning items in store or food in restaurants. In other words, the one thing they're terrified is that somebody will interact with them and other people will see them and that they will become anxious in that situation. Performance situations, very common. Public speaking, talking in front of others, eating or drinking in front of others, using public restrooms if others are nearby, playing sports, this was the example of the tennis player, playing music or acting in front of others, or being caught out making mistakes in front of others. Typical thoughts must be, everybody must like me. How many people really believe that? Everybody must like me. I have nothing interesting to say and I'm completely boring. The number of people that I have to deal with who think they're boring. One of my favourite questions is, can you tell me what a boring person looks like? Because I want to be able to recognise them walking down the street. What do you mean by... If I got two of you to talk to each other, I got a man and a woman, and the man was to start talking about the latest soccer match last night, and the woman was to start talking about the latest sets of shoes that are in. And one started talking non-stop about the latest set of shoes, and the other started talking non-stop about sport. Eventually the two of them would look at each other and they'd say to each other, geez, that guy is so boring. All he does talk about sport. And he said, Jesus, that woman is so boring. All that she's doing is talking about shoes. What they both realise is that neither is boring. They're just talking about a subject that the other person finds boring. There's a very subtle distinction. Okay? It's a nice thought, actually. It's a nice idea. I'll make a fool of myself. Well, I do that all the time, so I don't worry about that. Others will notice and find me wanting. That's the key. Others will find me wanting. Wanting what? But that's what goes on in their mind. If all went well, nobody will notice. This is a really important one. So if everything goes well, nobody will notice that I was part of it. However, if it goes badly, it was all my fault. Geez, you can't win, can you? That's what the politicians feel like. So learned social behaviours include staying close to the exit, trying to cover up the blushing with makeup, sweating. You'll often see people with the jacket on them, even in the middle of a hot environment in the pub, because they don't want to see the person see that they're sweating. Gripping cups or glasses very tightly. Continuously rehearsing over and over again what are they going to say, and I wonder how is it coming over. And above all, avoid eye contact. So the origin lies in our genes, social upbringing, and I think a very important one, overtly critical negative experiences at home or at school, including teasing or bullying. So what often happened is at a crucial phase in the person's life, somebody began to kind of get on their back about something, being overtly critical, making them hypercritical of themselves. And from then on, off it goes. And these people become very, very isolated, and this is one of the few anxiety disorders which can lead to self-harm. Treatment of phobias include lifestyle exercise like exercise, yoga, massage, stress-reducing, drug therapies, tranquilizers, try and avoid if you can, Depressants, generally not of significant help. St. John's wort, again, not of significant help. Talk therapies include counselling, very helpful. Behaviour therapy, cognitive therapy, which I think is probably the one of choice. CBT involves the acceptance that phobias are really red herrings. That's all they are. They're simply red herrings. It's not the object or situation that's the problem. It's the fact that exposure to them is going to lead me to become incredibly anxious. That's really what the person is worried about. So often, simple phobias can be dealt with in a few simple sessions. A behavioural kind of approach can be very helpful there. More complex ones like social phobia will require a lot more in-depth response, usually from a fully trained therapist. In agoraphobia, the CBT would recognise that the main fear is the person will have a panic attack exposed to the situation, so the therapist will have to teach the sufferer how to deal with a panic attack. If you teach them to deal what to do. Nobody ever teaches, by the way, anybody in our community how to deal with emotional distress of any form. The biggest thing a lack in our country, really. We need to start teaching children from very early on how to deal with emotional distress. So people with anxieties and phobias don't know how to deal with their distress. So a lot of the time it's normalising it, and that often reduces the fear of the exposure to the situation. And graded behavioural exercises can be of help as well. The social phobia, however, the real worry for them is that others will see them as they see themselves. And they'll spend a lot of time checking their own performance, whether they're blushing or sweating. A very good idea, get them to actually, on a scale of 1 to 10, rate how much they're blushing. And then tell them, go out to the loo, look in the mirror, and actually see whether it's actually matching what they rate. They'll often find it's not. So the CBT challenge their thinking and their behaviour. Okay, we're going to do 3 main kinds of chronic anxiety: post-traumatic stress disorder, OCD, and general anxiety. Post-traumatic stress disorder is one you have to keep an eye out for. I certainly have found over the years that it's amazing how it can be absolutely hidden for years and years and years, and the person will maybe present with something like panic attacks or some other symptoms like that, and it's only maybe in the process of uncovering the information that you might spot that they've actually had, say, a significant trauma, maybe sometime in their past. It could be a road traffic accident, could be the death of a loved person, and it's from there the fun begins. It's a chronic persistent anxiety state, usually following serious accidents, rape, so obviously sexual abuse, assault, war, obviously I've dealt with some of these as well, which last for a period of greater than 6 months. Symptoms typically include flashbacks, nightmares, a reluctance to deal with the problem, muscle pains, headaches, panicky feelings. Many feel ashamed or guilty that they're still alive. That's an important point, actually, that many people who survive crashes, particularly when somebody's been killed, are actually guilty and almost ashamed that they're still alive. And they often get quite down. They're constantly on guard. That's the real way you pick them out. The person with a post-traumatic stress disorder spends their whole life almost scanning the environment all the time, looking to see, have they missed something? They're always looking for trouble. And they have often difficulties with sleep and regularly misuse alcohol and etc. Drug therapy includes the SSRIs, antidepressants, which can be of help in serious cases, particularly if depression is present. Talk therapy is extremely useful here. The CBT approach would be looking for the demand for 100% certainty that they won't be exposed to the trauma again, because that's actually what's at the heart of the whole thing. They're actually bothered that either they or somebody close to them will actually have something serious happen to them, and that's at the heart of it. Crack that, and you crack the whole thing. Classic example is following a road traffic accident. So one of my favourite statements is, has anybody ever seen a car with a stamp on the front of it that says, this car can't crash? Do you know, and yet many people have that thought in their head that they want 100% certainty that they will not crash. Now, this is a really common one. I believe this is one of the real hidden conditions in Ireland, that we don't talk about. It affects women, plus, plus, plus. Constant bursts of intense anxiety and worrying about our health, family and jobs. A constant sense of foreboding about impending disaster. Mental and physical exhaustion, which is usually the reason they come looking for medical help. Irritable bowel, poor concentration and memory, sleep problems and nightmares, indecisiveness and difficulty coping, and constantly avoiding everyday tasks. So they won't start the task unless they're absolutely sure that it can be done perfectly. So they'll often not start the task at all. And then the tasks build up, and then they get more anxious because the tasks are building up. Commonly associated with bouts of acute anxiety will deteriorate if stress occurs. 2/3 will have at least one episode of depression. Many use alcohol to cope. This is the source of the wine epidemic in women. Many, many women cope with general anxiety by drinking wine. And, it becomes an anxiety relieving agent. But it doesn't solve the problem, but it often creates another problem. Many end up being addicted to tranquilizers. Women are twice as likely to have it. Very often not diagnosed, can be often traced to childhood. So for example, recurrent abdominal pain of children is often an early warning sign, I think, of general anxiety in the adults. I can recall one mother ringing me from down the country about her child who had been brought everywhere for recurrent abdominal pain. So when I started gently asking a couple of questions about the whole world of anxiety, the mother very quickly said, well, actually, I can relate to an awful lot of that. Do you know what I mean? So in other words, the child was actually absorbing the messages from the mother, even though the mother didn't realize it. The causes are a powerful mix of genetic predisposition and upbringing. It's really a hyped up stress box. Similar genetic pathways to depression, and up to 15 resilience genes involved. Do you know what a resilience gene is? Resilience genes are very interesting things that they have actually done a lot of research on, are there specific genes that predispose people towards particular conditions? So they've looked at, for example, anxiety, and they found a group of genes that the classical one being one of these serotonin genes, and that they noticed that if a person, there were 3 possibilities, if they had, say, too long, too short, and a short and a long, that people who had the 2 longs seemed to handle stress very well and very rarely became anxious. People with 2 shorts were far more likely to suffer significant anxiety, depression, and in fact even greater suicide risk. So there is these predispositions. Now, just because of a predisposition, does that mean that it will automatically occur? No, the answer is unequivocally no. Is that okay? What happens in your brain is your brain has this incredible ability to make new pathways in the brain. It reshapes the brain. So if I, for example, grow up I suppose about 15% of babies they feel are actually born anxious. In other words, they're already predisposed to being anxious just as they're born. And yet, if they grow up in kind of fairly loving, low-key, kind of comfortable kind of environments, many of those will lose that. But if they grow up in a real anxious, hyped-up, stressed-out house, the chances are that will get expressed. Is that okay? So in other words, genes only mean predisposition, that's all. Your environment then decides what pathways will be laid down in your brain. And the great news is that you can reshape these pathways with therapy, which is very positive, isn't it? Okay, the ideal treatment is holistic, exercise. One of the most important things in mental health is 30 minutes of exercise every day. Nutrition, because most people with general anxiety eat very, very poorly. Meditation, incredibly useful for this area. Yoga meditation have an important role. Try and avoid alcohol and tranquilizers. CBT is very powerful. Mindfulness is very, very useful. Mindfulness-based CBT is probably one for the future. It's been used a lot in stress management and a little bit in the prevention of depression. SSRIs can be helpful if you have very serious kind of general anxiety. It can be very helpful. Particularly if depression is present, but most of the time psychological treatments are the way to go. You'll see a lot of these, by the way, and I guarantee you every solitary person here is missing general anxiety. So just keep it at the back of your mind, because loads of people have it, and loads of people it's not picked up. OCD, I'll finish with this, affects between 20 and 30,000 people every year. Very distressing condition, characterized by persistent obsessive thoughts, followed by repeated compulsive behavior to ease the anxiety created by the former. So an obsession is an intrusive, anxiety-provoking thought, idea, or image. And compulsions are repetitive rituals or mental actions performed as a result of obsessions in order to decrease anxiety and remove contaminants. So very simple ideas. I, for example, think that the door is not locked. So I go and I check the door. And then I go away and I'm 10 yards down the road and I begin to get very anxious. Did I really check that door? So back I go and I check the door again. So the obsessive thought is, really, the door is not locked. The obsessive ritual action is, I have to go back and check the door. So this is a very interesting condition, because in many ways this was the first condition that really opened up the whole world of neuroscience. Because people with OCD built into their lives a complex series of safety and avoidant behaviours which cause chaos. Absolute chaos. This causes chaos in people's lives and the lives of those around them. They recognise the obsessive thoughts as intrusive and troublesome and coming from their minds. They know they're not. They know these thoughts are not true, but they just can't stop them. So the modern view of this illness is actually a type of behaviour addiction, similar to other addictions. So the obsessive thoughts and compulsions use up all the person's energies due to the incredible symptoms of anxiety to produce. And unfortunately, this is the really sad bit, it can take up to a minimum of 10 years to make the diagnosis. So a lot of people in trouble for long periods of time. So these are typical thoughts. Fear of contaminating themselves, dirt, germs, blood, bodily fluids, feces. Fears over person's health, harming themselves. So you have the person who's actually genuinely harming themselves, and then you have the OCD person whose fear is that they will harm themselves. And I've had a number of, say, mothers in with this terrible obsessive fear that they're going to harm their children. And every time they hear something in the news, do you know what I mean, that somebody has hurt a child or something like that, they come because up comes the thought again that they're going to do it themselves. Fears of hurting others, fears of being gay or paedophile, huge problem. Fear of offending God, and fear that something terrible will happen. Well, at the moment, there's probably a reasonable fear of that. Reasonable grounds for that. Examples of compulsive behaviour include cleaning. I have to say I don't fall into this one. Particularly the home cleaning. Checking the front doors or the light switches. Counting or making lists. Arranging everything in the room, that everything must be in the right place, and making lists and hoarding. Now, one of the problems that I find is that it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish between a real OCD, a true-blown OCD, and a person with anxiety who just has certain behaviours. Do you know what I mean? So not every person who, say, is very, wants everything tidy in the right place is an OCD. Many of them are just anxieties, general anxiety. The compulsions persist as the sufferer gets a short-term relief from anxiety from the obsessive thoughts, but eventually become the problem. So, for example, if I'm late for work and I have to keep checking the door and go back and checking the door and go back and checking the door, well, I'm going to be late for work every day, aren't I? So, eventually what leads the person to come for help is when their behaviour causes so much chaos in their life that they can't put up with it any longer. Some obsessive thoughts go hand in hand, like obsession with germs in my hand with hand washing, wiping down the door handles in the toilets, or obsessive thoughts about the door being locked with checking the door are typical examples. Slightly more common in women, and it can start as young as 10. So you often see it in teenagers. Women suffer more from contaminant obsessions and cleaning rituals. I wonder why. Men suffer more from symmetry, order, and sexual obsessions. I wonder why. Depression is quite common as a secondary consequence of OCD, so it's a very significant condition. It's the first illness, very interestingly, where neurological pathways were discovered on neuroimaging of the brain. I think this was really interesting. Up to that, it was always thought that you wouldn't be able to identify on scanning, a particular disorder in the brain. So, very interestingly, they found that it was a breakdown in communication between the social behaviour box there, the attention box, and an area called the caudate nucleus. So they actually began to see hyperactivity of this kind of pathway in these people suffering from this condition. What happens is they finally come up with a kind of an idea of what actually is going on. So what they think happens is that when we get a simple thought like the front door is not locked, it's the social behaviour box there that clicks in that makes you feel a bit anxious to go back and check the door. So when we get this simple thought, it fires. So it passes information to the attention box there, and the attention box is basically initiates you starting the behaviour to go and check the door. But finally, there's an area, it's not marked here, but it's kind of further down this area in here, called the caudate nucleus, and its job is to move thoughts on. So what actually happens is, it's like a gear change in the car. You can't move on to the next thought. So in OCD, the caudate nucleus is stuck. So normally if I get the thought, the door's not locked, I go back and I check, I become anxious, go back and check it. I now move on to the next thought. Geez, I wonder what the boss has in store for me today at work. But for the person with OCD, they can't go on. They can't move on to that thought. So they go back to the original thought. So they kind of go round and round and round and round. And that's actually what happens in OCD. So when the person with OCD, with therapy though, begins to kind of improve, the really fascinating part of this, and this was the first signs, in my opinion, of us really understanding the importance of neuroplasticity, or the ability of the brain to change. That what actually happened was, with therapy, the area went back to normal. Wasn't that very interesting? So that was the first indicator ever, really, that real therapy could actually have a transformational effect on the pathways in the brain, and we could actually measure it, which was very exciting to lots of people. And really we've moved on to examine every condition now with that in mind. So causes are very much genetic and upbringing, and very interestingly, believe it or not, in a certain number of children, it can actually be triggered by an actual viral infection. Very interesting. Severity can go from mild to severe, but can become very severe with age if left untreated. Shame is the usual reason that they come for help, because they just can't put up with it any longer, the behavioural consequences. Shame is the reason that they don't come for help, and it's the consequences of their behaviour that finally bring them, and it's often the family that bring them, because they can't put up with it any longer. Drug therapies are very important here. This is one of the anxiety conditions where high doses of SSRIs are actually genuinely really helpful. Sometimes you can use atypical drugs as well, can be useful here, because they actually assist the brain in readjusting the focus, but they take about 8 weeks to kick in. John's wort is used in some countries. I'm not so in favour of John's wort because I think you can't control the quality of the product. Drug therapy can improve the situation by up to 50%. And the rest lies with talk therapies, particularly kind of behaviour type therapy and CBT. Lifestyle therapies are always important. Counselling is a very helpful, particularly dealing with the relationship consequences of OCD. And CBT and behaviour therapies challenge the compulsive behaviour and the demand for control, which lies at the heart. I must be certain the door is locked. Secret to all anxiety, because you've been very good listening to me. The secret to all anxiety disorders, if you notice, I use the word normalise in big letters, okay? Anxiety is normal. So we need to normalise the symptoms. If you can get that idea into your mind of normalise the symptoms of anxiety for the person, and you'll find that very quickly they return to normal. The symptoms are usually uncomfortable but not dangerous. Always challenge safety or avoiding behaviour. And for those who would like to investigate more, that's Flagging the Therapy. I think that's probably the best book for all of this. That's a more recent book for depression, Flagging Depression, a Practical Guide. Okay, you've been very good. And I'm laughing there really, because you now know what the word boring means. Okay. So, if anybody has any questions before I take off. Yes, yep.
What would you advise for somebody who comes to you already on all the medications?
I think the whole
there's a lot.
Yeah, I think it's a problem. I think an awful lot depends what the initial diagnosis was. Like you might be seeing the person at the tail end of an event. For example, a person might have started with depression, had anxiety episodes. The depression is improved, but nobody's dealing with the anxiety. Do you know what I mean? Mm. So I think in those circumstances, you have to leave the person as they are. Do you know what I mean? You work on what your job is to work on their thinking and their behaviour. Do you know what I mean? That would be my view. I think if you feel in certain situations that maybe a person is maybe not appropriately on medication, do you know what I mean? Well, you could ask them to go back and have a word with their doctor, their psychiatrist, whoever referred them, or whoever put them on the medication to start with.
But you see, then you've got the whole issue of bringing them, shall we say, managing them down from, presuming that, let's say, the talk therapies work.
Yes, yeah.
Then it's.
Well, then I think it's
gradual withdrawal. And
yes, I think it's back to the person who put them on it to organize. I don't think that should be your job.
No.
But I think it's back to the person then to try to get them, which can be very difficult sometimes. Do you know what I mean? Because people get very dependent on medication. Do you know?
Yeah, exactly.
But I think the key thing is. Your side of the picture, do you know what I mean, is to really work on the things you can work on. Do you know what I mean? Like when I'm dealing with depression, for example, one of my great things with depression is the role of an antidepressant is to make a person functioning so they can get involved in talk therapies which help them to get better. Do you know what I mean? So it's a mix. And I really get very tired of I call it the almost monotonous lining up of troops on one side versus the other side, instead of everybody standing away and looking at the brain. Look, the brain responds to a number of different therapies, lifestyle therapies, exercise, the most important one of all that nobody ever talks about, empathy, the most important one. Do you know what I mean? Exercise, empathy, those are very powerful therapy. But if we start get into this, I call it banging heads against each other, do you know what I mean? Medication has a role, talk therapy has a role. Each person is an individual, and whatever the mixture is for that person will vary from person to person. So to do away with this whole idea of being fixed, the brain is the most malleable organ we have. It's well able to change and adjust and adapt. But I often feel that we nearly get in the way of that, do you know what I mean, by being too fixed ourselves,
In post-traumatic stress disorder, could the triggering event be something like a traumatic birth or something that happened shortly after that of which the person has no memory?
I'm always slightly wary of a situation where a person has no memory of an event. There are huge risks for therapists, in my opinion, in going down the road of... like I can recall one particular person was sent to me from the other side of the country, and the person had been convinced by a therapist because of this memory thing that they had been abused. They actually were very depressed and had been for some time. When their depression was properly treated, they actually realized that the whole abuse thing had been a complete and total non-event. So I think we have to be very, very careful in those areas. I think what you're asking me is a good question. Like, if a person has a particularly traumatic event, but they don't know whether that's the trauma or not, do you know what I mean? I think if you can't identify the trauma, but you feel a trauma did exist, do you know what I mean? Then all you can do is work on, well, why is it bothering them now? Always remember that. I often feel, always ask the person, why are you here now? It's a very good question to think at the back of your head. Like, so many people are so anxious to go back, do you know what I mean, and find out everything that happened in their past. The big thing is, what brought you to see me here today? Something triggered that. And when you get to that, you're often up and running, do you know what I mean? Because that'll tell you where to search. Do you know what we don't do? And I have to say, I'm number one guilty of this. We don't listen. Yeah. We don't listen, and I mean not just listen, I mean listen attentively. Do you know what I mean? Listen not just for what the person's saying, but for the nuances. Do you know what I mean? And often there's the answers will be there, you know.
Can I ask you, do you think that sometimes patients get addicted to their own adrenaline, you know, in anxiety disorders?
I don't really think so, no. No, I mean, some people are adrenaline junkies, do you know what I mean? If you want to put like, these are the people who love to live dangerously and, you know, do rock climbing or, you know, major risky sports and things like that. But we call them adrenaline junkies. But I don't think anybody that I'm aware of is really, really happy that they're anxious. Do you know what I mean? Not too many people are saying, God, I'm really looking forward to my next panic attack. Do you know what I mean? So I think for most people, I don't think you really become hooked on the adrenaline. I think you probably become maybe adjusted to it or accustomed to it. Like many people will say to you, it's just, I just accepted it's part of me now, rather than saying, well, look, this is an issue I can do something about, you know. So.
Just talking about social phobia. If exposure doesn't help the problem, how can we help these people?
Well, you see, you have to go back to go back to their thinking and their behaviour. Remember, the only two things we can change. Can we change an emotion?
I think there are other people waiting to speak first.
Can we change an emotion?
If you know CBT.
Is it the job of a therapist to change an emotion? No. If I say to you, I don't want you to be anxious in the next week, you know. We can't change it, but we can certainly look on our thinking and our behaviour. Do you know what I mean? So it's a very good question. I'm going to throw it out. What do people think we could change in a person with social phobia? What's at the heart, you know, from what you learned today, what's at the heart of the problem? Fear of what? What is the person worried about? So, what's really at the heart of it, isn't it? Who is doing the rating? Themselves. Okay. So, isn't that the key? So, what you've got to do is you've got to look at their whole idea of, you know, rating, the whole concept of rating. So, you get them to challenge their concept of rating and of allowing other people's rating. Not you build on their self-esteem. Who here thinks we should build on their self-esteem?
I just want to, sorry, if I could just take the opportunity, we'll have one, first of all I want to really say thank you to Dr. Harry Barry for a very enlightening talk here today, and it's been really wonderful, and it's really wonderful that he's actually gone above and beyond his time here today, and I just want to also thank him that as well. And if there are any questions, maybe we can direct them in Dr. Harry's way in the future if you want to send them in to us, so that we'll allow people to take their leave and hit back to their places. Some of you have long ways to go. I know some of from the top end of the country. Thank you. Okay. And I'm not so sure whether, hopefully we might, with Dr. Barry's, we may be able to put the PowerPoint presentation live on the web, and we'll check, we'll talk that to. I have to get his permission for that, okay?
Read Flagging the Therapy.
Okay.
Seriously though, the read Flagging Therapy and learn about the raggy doll.
Gunari and Bohar Lat. Slán. Oh yeah, the 22nd of the 3rd. The date of the next AGM is the 22nd of the 3rd, 2014. I hope I'll get that right. So this 22nd of the 3rd, if you want to put it on your app, on an email or whatever, or even an old-fashioned diary,